The city of Nythra stood at the edge of the world where the sun's rays barely grazed the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountains. Its streets were narrow and winding, paved with stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the faint metallic tang of blood. Nythra was a city of secrets, a place where the past clung to the present like a shroud. And at its heart, towering over the skyline, was the temple of the forgotten god. No one remembered the god's name. It had been erased from history, its true form lost to time. But the people of Nythra worshipped it nonetheless, offering prayers and sacrifices to an entity they could not see, hear, or touch. They called it the Veiled One, the Silent Watcher, the Eternal Shadow. Its presence was felt in every corner of the city, in the way the wind whispered through the alleys, in the way the shadows seemed to move when no one was looking. The high priestess, a woman named Saloon, was the only one who claimed to hear the god's voice. She was a figure of awe and fear, her face hidden behind a mask of polished obsidian, her robes woven from threads of silver and black. Every night, she climbed the steps of the temple to perform the ritual of the veil, a ceremony that no one outside the priesthood had ever witnessed. The people of Nythra believed that it was this ritual that kept their city safe, that it was the reason the crops grew and the rains came. But not everyone believed. In the slums of Nythra, where the light of the temple's torches never reached, there were whispers of dissent. A young man named Kael was one of the few who dared to question the god's existence. He had grown up in the shadow of the temple, his life shaped by its rituals and rules, but he had always felt a strange unease in its presence. The stories of the god's power, of the miracles it had performed, seemed too perfect, too convenient. And the sacrifices. Always animals, but sometimes, it was rumored, something more, left a bitter taste in his mouth. Kael's doubts had begun to grow into something more dangerous. He had started to gather others like him, people who had seen the cracks in the city's facade. They met in secret in the abandoned warehouses by the docks to discuss their suspicions. They called themselves the Unseen, a name that felt fitting for those who lived in the shadow of a god no one could see. One night, as the temple bells rang out across the city, Kael stood at the edge of the crowd that had gathered to watch the ritual of the veil. The high priestess stood at the top of the temple steps, her arms raised to the sky, her voice echoing through the square. The crowd was silent, their faces upturned, their eyes filled with a mixture of reverence and fear. Kael felt a chill run down his spine as he watched. There was something wrong about the way the shadows seemed to gather around her, something unnatural. As the ritual reached its climax, a sudden gust of wind swept through the square, extinguishing the torches and plunging the city into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The crowd gasped, some falling to their knees, others turning to flee. Kael stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never heard anything like it before. When the torches were relit, the high priestess was gone. The crowd murmured in confusion, their fear turning to panic. Kael felt a hand on his arm and turned to see one of the unseen, a woman named Lyra. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear it?" she whispered. "The growl?" Kael nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He had heard it and he knew what it meant. The god, or whatever it was real. And it was awake. The disappearance of the high priestess sent shockwaves through Nythra. The city, already cloaked in an air of mystery, now teetered on the edge of chaos. The temple priests, usually so composed, moved through the streets with hurried steps, their faces pale and drawn. The people whispered among themselves, their voices trembling with fear and uncertainty. What had happened to Saloon? Had the Veiled One taken her? Or had she failed in her duties, incurring the god's wrath? Kael and the Unseen watched it all from the shadows. The growl that had echoed through the square during the ritual had shaken them to their core, but it had also confirmed their suspicions. The god, or whatever it was not a benevolent force. It was something darker, something hungry. And now, with the high priestess gone, the city was vulnerable. Kael knew they had to act quickly. The Unseen gathered in their usual meeting place, an abandoned warehouse near the docks. The air was thick with tension as they discussed their next steps. Lyra, her hands trembling, spoke first. "We need to find out what happened to Saloon," she said. "If the god took her, we need to know why. And if she's still alive, we need to find her." Kael nodded, his mind racing. "The temple is the key," he said. "Everything we need to know is in there. But we can't just walk in. We need a plan." The Unseen spent hours debating their options. The temple was heavily guarded and its inner sanctum was off-limits to all but the highest-ranking priests. But Kael had an idea. He had heard rumors of a hidden entrance, a passage that led from the catacombs beneath the city directly into the temple's lower levels. It was a dangerous path, one that few had ever taken, but it might be their only chance. That night, Kael and a small group of the unseen made their way to the catacombs. The entrance was hidden beneath an old mausoleum in the city's graveyard, its stone door covered in moss and ivy. Kael pushed it open with effort, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The air inside was cold and damp, the walls lined with ancient bones. They lit torches and began their descent, the flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The catacombs were a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers, each one more foreboding than the last. As they walked, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing in the corners of his vision. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand, but the unease grew with every step. After what felt like hours, they reached the passage that led to the temple. The door was old and rusted, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the torchlight. Kael hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. He glanced back at the others, their faces pale but determined. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The passage beyond was narrow and dark, the walls slick with moisture. They moved slowly, their footsteps echoing softly in the silence. As they approached the temple, the air grew heavier, the shadows deeper. Kael could feel it now, the presence of the god. It was like a weight pressing down on his chest, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to seep into his very soul. Finally, they reached the end of the passage. A small, hidden door led into the temple's lower levels. Kael pushed it open cautiously, peering into the dimly lit corridor beyond. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the walls were lined with ancient tapestries depicting the god in various forms, a shadowy figure, a towering beast, a swirling mass of darkness. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. They moved through the temple with caution, avoiding the patrolling priests. The lower levels were a maze of corridors and chambers, each one filled with relics and artifacts from the city's past. Kael's heart raced as they searched for any sign of Selûne or the god's true nature. But as they turned a corner, they froze. Ahead of them, in a large, circular chamber, stood a group of priests. They were gathered around a massive stone altar, their heads bowed in prayer. On the altar lay the body of a young woman, her skin pale and lifeless. Kael's breath caught in his throat as he realized who it was. Selûne. But something was wrong. Her body was surrounded by a swirling mass of shadows, tendrils of darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The priests chanted in a language Kael didn't recognize, their voices low and guttural. As he watched, the shadows began to seep into Selûne's body, her skin turning black as the darkness consumed her. Kael felt a surge of panic. He wanted to rush forward, to stop whatever was happening. But Lyra grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "Wait," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't just charge in. We need to think." Kael nodded, his mind racing. They needed a plan, but time was running out. As they watched, Selûne's body began to twitch, her limbs moving unnaturally. The priests stepped back, their chanting growing louder. And then, with a sudden, violent motion, Selûne sat up. Her eyes were open, but they were no longer human. They were pools of darkness, swirling with an otherworldly light. She turned her head slowly, her gaze falling on Kael and the others. A cold, cruel smile spread across her face. "You should not have come," she said, her voice echoing with a power that was not her own. Kael's blood turned to ice as Selûne's dark, swirling eyes locked onto him. Her voice, now a chilling blend of her own and something far more ancient, reverberated through the chamber. The priests turned as one, their faces masks of fury and fear. Kael and the unseen were exposed, their presence no longer hidden. The air grew heavier, the shadows around them twisting and writhing as if alive. "Run!" Kael shouted, his voice breaking through the paralyzing fear that had gripped the group. They turned and bolted back down the corridor, their footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. Behind them, the priests gave chase, their chanting rising to a fevered pitch. Kael could feel the god's presence pressing down on him, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. The unseen sprinted through the temple's lower levels, their torches flickering wildly as they ran. Kael led the way, his mind racing as he tried to remember the path they had taken. The corridors seemed to shift and change, the walls closing in around them. It was as if the temple itself was alive, working against them. He could hear the priests gaining ground, their voices growing louder. "Kael!" Lyra shouted, her voice strained. We can't outrun them. Kael knew she was right. They needed to find a way to lose their pursuers. But the temple was a labyrinth. As they rounded a corner, he spotted a narrow alcove hidden behind a crumbling tapestry. Without hesitation, he grabbed Lyra and pulled her into the alcove, motioning for the others to follow. They pressed themselves against the wall, their breaths coming in shallow gasps as the priests ran past, their footsteps fading into the distance. For a moment there was silence. Kael's heart pounded in his chest as he strained to listen. The temple was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint crackling of their torches. He glanced at the others, their faces pale and drawn. They were all thinking the same thing. They had seen something they were never meant to see. What do we do now? One of the unseen whispered, his voice trembling. Kael took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. We need to get out of here, he said. But we can't just leave. We have to find out what's going on. If she's been taken by the god, we need to know why. And we need to stop it. Lyra nodded, her expression grim. But how? We're outnumbered, and they have the god on their side. Kael hesitated. He didn't have an answer. The god's power was beyond anything he had ever imagined, and they were just a handful of rebels with no weapons or plan. But as he thought, an idea began to form. The temple was ancient, its secrets buried deep. If they could find something, a weapon, a relic, anything, that could give them an edge, they might stand a chance. We need to find the temple's archives, he said. If there's any information about the god, it'll be there. The others nodded, their determination hardening. They knew the risks, but they also knew they couldn't turn back now. Kael led the way, moving cautiously through the corridors. The temple was vast, its halls filled with statues and carvings of the Veiled One. The air grew colder as they descended deeper, the shadows thickening around them. Finally, they reached the archives. The room was massive, its walls lined with shelves filled with ancient scrolls and tomes. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a single, flickering torch mounted on the wall. Kael and the others began to search, their hands trembling as they pulled scrolls from the shelves. It was Lyra who found it. A scroll wrapped in black cloth, its surface covered in strange symbols. She unrolled it carefully, her eyes widening as she read. Kael, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You need to see this. Kael hurried over, his heart racing. The scroll was written in an ancient language, but the symbols were accompanied by illustrations, images of the Veiled One, its form shifting and changing. But there was something else, something that made Kael's blood run cold. The scroll spoke of a ritual, a way to summon the god and bind it to a mortal vessel. And it spoke of a price, a sacrifice. This is what they're doing, Kael said, his voice tight with fear. They're trying to bring the god into this world. But why? What do they gain from it? Lyra shook her head. I don't know, but if they succeed, if the god is unleashed, it could destroy everything. Kael clenched his fists, his mind racing. They had to stop the priests, but they were running out of time. As he turned to speak, a sudden noise made them all freeze. It was a low, guttural growl, the same sound they had heard in the square. The shadows around them began to shift, the air growing colder. They're coming, Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. Kael nodded, his heart pounding. We need to move, now. They gathered the scroll and began to make their way back through the temple, their steps hurried and frantic. But as they turned a corner, they came face to face with Selûne. Her eyes were still pools of darkness, her smile cruel and mocking. You cannot escape, she said, her voice echoing with the god's power. The Veiled One sees all. You are but insects, scurrying in the dark. Kael felt a surge of defiance. We won't let you do this, he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. We won't let you unleash the god. Selûne laughed, a sound that sent chills down their spines. You are too late, she said. The ritual is already complete. The Veiled One walks among you. As she spoke, the shadows around her began to coalesce, forming a towering figure of darkness. The air grew heavy, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Kael and the unseen backed away, their eyes wide with terror. The god had awakened. The chamber seemed to shrink as the Veiled One took form, its towering figure of shadow and darkness radiating an oppressive, otherworldly presence. Its shape was fluid, constantly shifting, a mass of writhing tendrils, jagged edges, and glowing voids that resembled eyes. The air grew icy, and the torches flickered weakly, their light barely piercing the suffocating gloom. Kael and the unseen stood frozen, their breaths visible in the cold, their hearts pounding in unison. Selûne, her body now a vessel for the god, stepped forward, her movements unnaturally smooth. Her voice was no longer her own. It was a chorus of whispers, each one layered with malice and ancient power. "You have seen what you were not meant to see," she said, her words echoing in their minds as much as in their ears. "Now you will serve as the first offerings in this new age." Kael's mind raced. He clutched the scroll they had found in the archives, the parchment trembling in his hands. If the ritual was complete, as Selûne claimed, then the god was already here. But the scroll had mentioned a binding, a way to control or contain the god. If they could find a way to reverse the ritual, they might still have a chance. "Lyra," Kael whispered, his voice barely audible over the god's oppressive presence. "The scroll. Look for anything. A counter-ritual, a weakness, anything." Lyra nodded, her hands shaking as she unrolled the scroll. The others formed a protective circle around her, their eyes darting between Selûne and the looming figure of the Veiled One. The god's form shifted, its tendrils extending toward them, probing the air like serpents. One of the unseen, a man named Torin, stepped forward, brandishing a dagger. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice trembling but defiant. The tendrils recoiled slightly, as if amused by his bravado. Selûne laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the chamber. "Your defiance is meaningless," she said. "The Veiled One is eternal. Your lives are but a flicker in its shadow." Kael ignored her, his focus on Lyra as she scanned the scroll. "Here," she said suddenly, her voice urgent. "There's something, a binding ritual. It requires a sacrifice, but it might be enough to contain the god." Kael's stomach churned at the word sacrifice, but he nodded. "What do we need to do?" Lyra's eyes darted across the parchment. "We need to create a circle of binding, using the god's own essence. And we need a vessel, someone to contain it." Kael's heart sank. A vessel. Someone would have to take the god's essence into themselves, just as Selûne had. He looked at the others, their faces pale but determined. He knew what he had to do. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "I'll be the vessel." "No!" Lyra grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "Kael, you don't know what this will do to you. Could destroy you." Kael met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. "If it stops the god, it's worth it. We don't have a choice." The others hesitated, but there was no time to argue. The Veiled One was growing stronger, its form expanding, its tendrils reaching closer. Selûne watched them with a cruel smile, her dark eyes gleaming with malice. "Quickly," Kael said. "What do we need to do?" Lyra explained the ritual in hurried whispers. They needed to draw a circle using the god's essence, which meant they had to lure it into a specific pattern. The scroll mentioned a chant, a series of words in the ancient language that would weaken the god's hold on this world. And then Kael would have to step into the circle and become the vessel. The unseen moved quickly, their fear overshadowed by their determination. They used the ash from their torches to draw a rough circle on the stone floor, their hands trembling as they worked. Kael stood at the center, his heart pounding, his mind racing with doubts and fears. He didn't know if this would work, but he knew they had to try. As the circle was completed, Lyra began the chant, her voice trembling but clear. The words were strange and guttural, their meaning lost to time, but their effect was immediate. The Veiled One's form shuddered, its tendrils recoiling as if in pain. Selûne's smile faltered, her dark eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising in anger. You cannot defy the Veiled One. Kael stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. We can, he said, his voice steady. And we will. The god's form began to shrink, its essence drawn toward the circle. Kael felt a cold, searing pain as the shadows wrapped around him, their touch like ice and fire. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand firm. The others continued the chant, their voices growing stronger as the god's power waned. Selûne screamed, a sound of rage and desperation. She lunged toward the circle, but the unseen intercepted her, their combined strength holding her back. Kael's vision blurred as the god's essence flooded into him, his body trembling under the strain. He could feel its presence in his mind, a cold, malevolent force that threatened to overwhelm him. But he held on. He focused on the faces of the unseen, on the city of Nythra, on the people who had lived in fear for too long. He would not let the god win. The ritual reached its climax, the circle glowing with a faint, silver light. The Veiled One's form collapsed into Kael, its essence bound within him. The chamber fell silent, the oppressive presence lifting. Selûne slumped to the ground, her body limp, her eyes closed. Kael stood at the center of the circle, his breathing ragged, his body trembling. He could feel the god's presence within him, a cold, dark weight that pressed against his mind. But it was contained for now. Lyra rushed to his side, her face pale with worry. Kael? Are you still you? Kael nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. The god's whispers echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the burden he now carried. I'm still here, he said, his voice hoarse. But we need to leave. Now. The others nodded, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and fear. They helped Kael out of the circle, their steps hurried as they made their way back through the temple. The priests were nowhere to be seen, the halls eerily silent. As they emerged into the night air, Kael felt a surge of hope. They had done the impossible, they had contained the god. But he knew this was only the beginning. The Veiled One was still within him, its presence a constant threat. And Selûne, he didn't know what had become of her. The city of Nythra lay before them, its streets quiet, its people unaware of the danger that had been averted. Kael looked at the unseen, their faces filled with determination. They had faced the god and survived. But the fight was far from over. The unseen moved swiftly through the darkened streets of Nythra, their footsteps echoing softly against the cobblestones. Kael walked at the center of the group, his body still trembling from the ritual. The Veiled One's presence within him was like a cold, heavy stone in his chest, its whispers a constant murmur in the back of his mind. He clenched his fists, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the god's influence was relentless. Lyra stayed close to him, her eyes filled with concern. Kael, she said softly, how are you holding up? He forced a weak smile. I'm fine, he lied. We need to get somewhere safe. The priests will be looking for us. The others nodded, their faces grim. They knew the danger wasn't over. The temple's influence extended far beyond its walls, and the priests would stop at nothing to reclaim the god or its vessel. Kael could feel their desperation, their fear, but he also felt their determination. They had come too far to turn back now. They made their way to a hidden safe house in the slums, a crumbling building tucked away in a maze of narrow alleys. The unseen had used it before, but never for something like this. As they entered, Kael collapsed onto a wooden bench, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The others gathered around him, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and fear. What now? Torin asked, his voice hesitant. The god is bound, but what does that mean for us? For you, Kael? Kael shook his head, his mind racing. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing, they couldn't let the priests regain control. The scroll they had found in the archives was their only hope, but it was written in an ancient language, its secrets still largely unknown. We need to decipher the rest of the scroll, Kael said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. There might be a way to banish the god completely, or at least weaken its hold. But we need time. Lyra nodded, her expression determined. I'll work on it, she said. I know some of the ancient symbols. It won't be easy, but I'll do my best. Kael reached out and squeezed her hand, a silent gesture of gratitude. He knew the weight of what they were asking of her, but he also knew she was their best chance. The others began to discuss their next steps, their voices low and urgent. Kael listened, but his attention was divided. The Veiled One's whispers grew louder, more insistent. You cannot escape me, the god's voice echoed in his mind. I am a part of you now. You will serve me whether you will it or not. Kael clenched his teeth, trying to push the voice away. He couldn't let the god win. He had to stay in control. As the hours passed, Lyra worked tirelessly on the scroll, her brow furrowed in concentration. The others took turns keeping watch, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the priests. Kael sat in silence, his mind a battleground. The Veiled One's presence was a constant pressure, its influence seeping into his thoughts, his emotions. He could feel it probing his memories, searching for weaknesses. "You are strong," the god whispered, its voice almost soothing. "But you cannot fight me forever. Give in, and I will grant you power beyond your wildest dreams." Kael shook his head, his hands trembling. "No," he muttered under his breath. "I won't let you win." The others glanced at him, their faces filled with concern, but they didn't interrupt. They knew what he was going through, even if they couldn't fully understand it. Finally, Lyra looked up from the scroll, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I think I found something," she said. "There's a ritual, a way to banish the god. But it requires a specific artifact. A relic of the Veiled One." Kael leaned forward, his heart racing. "What kind of relic?" Lyra hesitated, her expression grim. "A shard of its essence," she said. "Something that was separated from it long ago. The scroll mentions a place, a hidden sanctuary where the shard was kept. But it's deep within the temple." Kael's stomach churned at the thought of returning to the temple, but he knew they had no choice. "We'll have to go back," he said. "It's the only way." The others nodded, their faces filled with determination. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. The Veiled One's power was growing, and if they didn't act soon, it would be too late. As they prepared to leave, Kael felt a surge of doubt. The god's whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You cannot defeat me," it said. "You are mine now." Kael closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He couldn't let the god's words shake his resolve. He had to stay strong, for the sake of the city, for the sake of the unseen. They moved through the streets under the cover of darkness, their steps silent and swift. The temple loomed ahead, its towering silhouette a stark reminder of the danger they faced. Kael could feel the god's presence growing stronger as they approached, its whispers a constant echo in his mind. As they reached the temple's entrance, Kael paused, his heart pounding. He looked at the others, their faces filled with determination. "Stay close," he said, "and be ready for anything." They entered the temple, their footsteps echoing softly in the vast, empty halls. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Kael led the way, his senses on high alert. He could feel the god's presence all around them, its essence pulsing in the walls, the floor, the air itself. They made their way to the lower levels, following the directions Lyra had deciphered from the scroll. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, the more oppressive the god's presence. Finally, they reached the hidden sanctuary, a small chamber hidden behind a crumbling wall. In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on it rested a shard of black crystal, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. Kael could feel the power radiating from it, a cold, malevolent force that made his skin crawl. "That's it," Lyra whispered. "The shard." Kael stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the crystal. As his fingers closed around it, a surge of energy shot through him, the god's whispers rising to a deafening roar. He staggered back, clutching the shard to his chest. "You cannot destroy me," the Veiled One's voice echoed in his mind. "I am eternal." Kael gritted his teeth, his vision blurring. "We'll see about that," he muttered. The others gathered around him, their faces filled with determination. They knew what came next, the final ritual, the one that would banish the god forever. But they also knew the cost. The shard was a piece of the Veiled One's essence, and destroying it would require a sacrifice. Kael looked at the others, his heart heavy. "I'll do it," he said. "I'm already bound to the god. It has to be me." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She knew he was right. The others stepped back, their faces filled with a mixture of grief and resolve. Kael took a deep breath, clutching the shard tightly. He could feel the god's presence within him, its essence intertwined with his own. But he also felt something else, a flicker of hope, a spark of defiance. He began the chant, his voice trembling but steady. The words were ancient, their power resonating through the chamber. The shard in his hands began to glow, its light growing brighter and brighter. The Veiled One's whispers grew louder, more desperate, but Kael didn't stop. As the ritual reached its climax, the shard shattered, its light exploding in a blinding burst. Kael felt a searing pain, a cold, burning sensation that spread through his body. The god's presence within him surged, its essence fighting to hold on, but the ritual was too strong. With a final, deafening roar, the Veiled One was banished, its essence torn from Kael's body and scattered into the void. Kael collapsed to the ground, his vision fading, his body numb. The last thing he saw was Lyra's face, her eyes filled with tears as she reached for him. Kael's world faded into darkness, the searing pain of the ritual giving way to a cold, numbing void. He felt weightless, as if he were floating in an endless sea of shadows. The Veiled One's whispers, once so loud and insistent, were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, he wondered if this was death, if he had sacrificed himself to banish the god. But then, faintly, he began to hear voices. They were distant at first, muffled and indistinct, but they grew clearer as he drifted back toward consciousness. "Kael? Kael, can you hear me?" It was Lyra's voice, filled with desperation and hope. Kael's eyelids fluttered, and he slowly became aware of the cold stone beneath him, the faint glow of torchlight, and the faces of the unseen gathered around him. His body ached, his limbs heavy and unresponsive, but he was alive. "Lyra!" He croaked, his voice barely audible. "Did it work?" Tears streamed down Lyra's face as she nodded. "It worked," she said, her voice trembling. "The Veiled One is gone." "You did it, Kael." The others murmured in agreement, their faces filled with relief and awe. Kael closed his eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. He had done it. The god was banished, its hold on Nythra broken. But the cost had been high. He could still feel the echoes of the Veiled One's presence within him, a lingering shadow that would never fully fade. As the unseen helped him to his feet, Kael took a moment to steady himself. His body felt weak, his mind clouded, but he knew they couldn't stay in the temple. The priests would return, and they needed to get as far away as possible. They made their way out of the temple, the once oppressive atmosphere now strangely calm. The city of Nythra lay before them, its streets still shrouded in darkness, but the air felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The unseen moved quickly, their steps hurried but purposeful. They needed to regroup, to plan their next steps. When they reached the safe house, Kael collapsed onto a makeshift bed, his body trembling with exhaustion. Lyra stayed by his side, her hand gripping his tightly. The others gathered around, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "What happens now?" Torin asked, his voice hesitant. "The god is gone, but the priests, they won't just disappear." Kael nodded, his mind racing despite his fatigue. "The priests will be lost without the Veiled One," he said. "Their power came from the god. Without it, they're just men. But we need to make sure they can't regain control." Lyra squeezed his hand. "We'll need to rally the people," she said. "They've lived in fear for too long. If we can show them that the god is gone, that they don't have to live under its shadow anymore, they'll stand with us." Kael smiled weakly. "You're right," he said. "But it won't be easy. The priests have ruled this city for centuries. They won't give up without a fight." The unseen spent the next few hours planning their next steps. They knew they had to act quickly before the priests could regroup. Lyra took charge, her sharp mind and quick thinking guiding their efforts. Kael, though weakened, did what he could to help, his determination unwavering. As dawn broke over Nythra, the city began to stir. The unseen moved through the streets, spreading the word of the Veiled One's banishment. At first, the people were hesitant, their fear of the priests too deeply ingrained. But as more and more joined their cause, the tide began to turn. The priests, desperate to maintain their power, tried to quell the uprising, but their efforts were in vain. Without the Veiled One, their influence was shattered. The people of Nythra, emboldened by the unseen's courage, rose up against their oppressors. The streets echoed with the sounds of rebellion, the city alive with a newfound hope. Kael watched it all from a distance, his body still weak but his spirit unbroken. He knew the fight wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead, and the scars of the past would take time to heal. But for the first time in centuries, Nythra was free. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its light over the city, Kael felt a sense of peace. The Veiled One was gone, its shadow lifted. The people of Nythra had a chance to build a new future, one free from fear and oppression. Lyra joined him, her face glowing with pride. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with awe. "We really did it." Kael nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "We did," he said, "but this is just the beginning. There's still so much to do." Lyra took his hand, her grip firm. "We'll do it together," she said. "All of us." Kael looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but he knew he couldn't have done it alone. The unseen, the people of Nythra, they had all played a part in this victory. As the city began to rebuild, Kael felt a sense of hope he hadn't known in years. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time he believed in a brighter future. The Veiled One was gone, and with it, the shadows that had plagued Nythra for so long. The dawn of a new age had begun.